In a winter that would later be known only as the White Ruin, when the wind scoured the plains bare and the cold was a physical predator, a single cabin stood as an island of impossible warmth. Outside its walls, the world was a maelstrom of white chaos, a monochrome hell where the air itself froze in the lungs. Inside other cabins, families huddled around iron stoves that glowed a furious cherry red, devouring wood with insatiable hunger. Yet the heat they gave was a fleeting, desperate thing. It scorched the air in a small circle, while leaving the corners of the room to the tyranny of the frost. When the wood ran out, as it always did, the heat died in minutes, and the killing cold bled back through the chinked logs. But in this one cabin, there was no roaring fire. There was only a great, silent mass of stone in the center of the room, radiating a deep, penetrating warmth that filled every corner with the placid comfort of a summer afternoon. The man inside had not fed it for 10 hours, yet it breathed heat as if it were a living thing. This was the paradox of Hiram's folly, the strange monument of rock and clay that his neighbors had mocked, the very thing that was now keeping his family alive, while the wisdom of generations failed all around them. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of quiet genius and forgotten history resonate with you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable. The story of that silent, warm stone began 2 winters before, with a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a cabin that should have had smoke rising from its chimney. Hiram had walked over to his neighbor Finn's place after the first thaw that followed a brutal 3-day ice storm. The world was encased in a thick, clear sheath of ice, beautiful and treacherous. The path was slick, and the trees drooped, their branches groaning under the crystalline weight. He'd expected to find Finn cursing and chipping away at his woodpile, which was sealed under a solid cap of ice. But there was no movement. He called out, his voice sounding thin and small in the still frozen air. There was no answer. The cabin door was not barred, but it was frozen shut at the threshold. Hiram put his shoulder to it, and the wood groaned in protest. He heaved again, and the ice holding the door gave way with a sharp crack like a breaking bone. The air that flowed out of the cabin was not just cold. It was the profound, empty cold of a place that had been without life for a long time. It was colder inside than it was outside. Finn and his wife Ada were inside. They were found wrapped in every blanket they owned, sitting in chairs pulled close to the cold, black potbelly stove. They looked as if they had simply fallen asleep waiting for a fire to be lit. But they were not asleep. The local doctor, a man of grim practicality, said they had succumbed to the cold. Their woodpile, just 20 yards from their door, was full, but it was entombed in 3 inches of solid ice. Their emergency stack inside had run out on the second night of the storm. They had burned a chair and their small table, but it was not enough. When their fuel was gone, the thin iron stove had gone cold in less than an hour, and the cabin became their tomb. Hiram listened, but he did not agree. As he stood over the 2 simple wooden crosses, a different thought began to form in his mind, a cold and sharp-edged realization that felt like a betrayal of the conventional wisdom that held his community together. It wasn't bad luck that killed Finn and Ada. It wasn't the ice storm, and it wasn't even the lack of wood inside their cabin. They died because their stove, the very heart of their home, the machine they depended upon for life, was a deeply flawed piece of technology. It was a cast-iron beast that demanded constant tribute. It burned fuel inefficiently, turning seasoned oak into a brief, violent burst of heat that went straight up the chimney pipe along with most of the potential energy. It created a bubble of scorching air right next to it, while sucking frigid drafts in through every crack and gap in the cabin walls. It was a design that offered the illusion of warmth, but provided no thermal stability. The moment it was not fed, it became a useless lump of cold metal. Finn and Ada had not frozen in a home. They had frozen inside a faulty machine. And in that moment of cold clarity, Hiram's grief transformed into a quiet, burning obsession. He would not become a victim of common sense. He would build something better. Hiram listened, but he did not agree. As he stood over the 2 simple wooden crosses, a different thought began to form in his mind, a cold and sharp-edged realization that felt like a betrayal of the conventional wisdom that held his community together. It wasn't bad luck that killed Finn and Ada. It wasn't the ice storm, and it wasn't even the lack of wood inside their cabin. They died because their stove, the very heart of their home, the machine they depended upon for life, was a deeply flawed piece of technology. It was a cast-iron beast that demanded constant tribute. It burned fuel inefficiently, turning seasoned oak into a brief, violent burst of heat that went straight up the chimney pipe along with most of the potential energy. It created a bubble of scorching air right next to it, while sucking frigid drafts in through every crack and gap in the cabin walls. It was a design that offered the illusion of warmth, but provided no thermal stability. The moment it was not fed, it became a useless lump of cold metal. Finn and Ada had not frozen in a home. They had frozen inside a faulty machine. And in that moment of cold clarity, Hiram's grief transformed into a quiet, burning obsession. He would not become a victim of common sense. He would build something better. That spring, Hiram became a changed man. The easy camaraderie he once shared with the other settlers faded. While they mended fences, planted gardens, and planned their summer trapping expeditions, Hiram was consumed by a singular problem: heat. He spent hours simply watching his own potbelly stove, not for its warmth, but for its failures. He felt the cold drafts it created, noticed how the floor remained frigid even when the stovepipe glowed red. He measured how much wood it consumed in a day, then in a week, and the numbers staggered him. It was a machine designed for waste. His wife, a quiet and observant woman named Sarah, watched him with concern but did not interfere. She saw the intensity in his eyes and knew this was not a passing fancy. His obsession drove him to seek knowledge beyond the confines of their small settlement. He told Sarah he was going to the trading post at Fort Laramie, a journey of several days. He was not going for supplies or to trade furs. He was going to talk to people who understood fire and heat in different ways. His journey was a methodical quest for disparate pieces of a puzzle that only he could see. He started by visiting other homesteads along the way, asking to see their heating arrangements. In every cabin he found the same story: the ubiquitous, inefficient iron stove, the constant battle for fuel, the accepted reality of cold corners and drafty floors. The problem was universal. At the fort, he did not head for the general store. He sought out the blacksmith. The man, a burly figure with arms like tree trunks, was initially gruff, annoyed by questions that had nothing to do with horseshoes or axe heads. But Hiram's persistence wore him down. He asked the blacksmith about his forge. "How does it hold its heat?" he pressed. The blacksmith grunted, wiping sweat from his brow with a leather-gloved hand. "The bricks," he said, gesturing to the heavy, fire-stained walls of the forge. "They soak up the fire. Even after the coals die down, I can't touch them for hours. They bleed the heat out slow." The words "soak up" and "bleed out slow" echoed in Hiram's mind. This was a critical piece. Heat could be stored. His next stop was the settlement's bakery. He watched the baker use his massive brick oven. The man would build a roaring fire inside the dome, let it burn for hours until the bricks were white hot, and then sweep out all the ash and coals. For the rest of the day, he baked dozens of loaves of bread using only the stored, radiant heat from the thick clay and brick walls. The baker explained, "It's a gentle heat, an even heat, not like an open flame that burns the bottom of the loaf. The oven breathes warmth." Hiram placed his hand on the outer wall of the oven. It was deeply, pleasantly warm, not hot enough to burn. It was another revelation. The heat could be contained, tamed, and made to radiate gently over a long period. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. An old stonemason named Alistair was working near the fort, constructing a massive hearth and chimney for the post commander's new residence. He was a craftsman from the old country, with gnarled hands that knew the language of stone. Hiram watched him for a full day, observing the precise way he fit the stones together, the care he took with his mortar. Finally, Hiram approached him. He didn't ask about fireplaces, he asked about the heaters of Alistair's homeland. The old man's eyes lit up. He spoke of tiled stoves, the kachalofen of his youth. "They were not just a place for a fire," Alistair explained, his voice thick with an accent. "They were the heart of the house, a great mass of brick and tile. The fire you built inside was small and hot, burned away quick, but the smoke did not go straight up." He sketched a diagram in the dirt with a stick. He drew a firebox, and then from it, a long, winding channel that snaked back and forth through the interior of the stove's mass before it was allowed to exit through the chimney. "You make the smoke walk a long road," he said, tapping the drawing. "And on that long road, the smoke must give up all its heat to the stone. By the time it leaves the chimney, the smoke is cool. All the warmth stays in the house, in the stone. One small fire in the morning, the stove is warm all day and all night." That was it. That was the key. Hiram stared at the crude drawing in the dirt as if it were a sacred text. The insight was a paradigm shift. An efficient stove wasn't about making a bigger fire. It was about capturing the heat from a smaller fire. It required two things he now understood: thermal mass to store the heat, and a long, convoluted flue path to transfer that heat into the mass. He realized something else, too. The baker's oven and the blacksmith's forge burned hot and fast. This suggested a different kind of combustion, more complete than the smoldering, smoky fires in their potbelly stoves. He imagined a system where the fire was so hot it would burn the smoke itself. He returned to the trading post, his mind alight with designs. His shopping list was strange. He didn't buy traps or ammunition or sacks of flour. He bought a dozen heavy, pale fire bricks, the kind used to line forges. He purchased several sacks of fire clay. From the blacksmith, he commissioned a small, heavy, airtight cast-iron door, no bigger than a dinner plate, and two other smaller iron plates for clean-out ports. He packed his mule and began the journey home, his thoughts not on the trail, but on the monument of stone and clay he was about to build in the center of his cabin. When he arrived back at his settlement, his neighbor Corwin saw the unusual cargo. "What's all that, Hiram?" Corwin asked, a smirk already playing on his lips. "You planning on building a fortress?" Hiram just nodded, his eyes distant. "Something like that," he said, and went inside. The deconstruction of the old world began with a wrench and a hammer. Hiram dismantled the familiar potbelly stove, its thin iron pipe, and the metal sheet that protected the floor. When it was gone, the cabin felt strangely empty, a void in its center where the false heart had been. For years, their lives had revolved around that inefficient beast. Now, it lay in pieces in the yard, looking like the discarded shell of some dead insect. His son Samuel, a boy of 14 with his father's quiet demeanor, watched with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. "What are we building, Pa?" he asked. "A better fire," Hiram replied simply. The work began at the foundation. Hiram used a plumb bob to find the exact center of the cabin. There, he and Samuel pried up the floorboards, exposing the dark, packed earth beneath. They dug a square pit, 4 feet by 4 feet and 3 feet deep. It was slow, arduous labor. They hauled the dirt out in buckets, their muscles straining. This hole, which would be filled with rock and sand, would support the immense weight of the structure to come and isolate it from the ground, preventing the precious heat from leaching away into the earth. They spent 2 days filling the pit with large stones gathered from a nearby creek bed, fitting them together like a 3-dimensional puzzle, then tamping sand and gravel into the gaps until they had a solid, stable pier. Upon this foundation, the true construction began. Using the fire bricks he had hauled from the fort, Hiram meticulously built the firebox. It was shockingly small, a cube barely 18 inches on a side. Samuel looked at it, confused. "That's not big enough for a decent log," he observed. "It's not meant for a decent log," Hiram explained, his voice patient. "It's meant for a small, hot fire that burns fast and clean, like a blacksmith's forge." He lined the firebox with a layer of fire clay, smoothing it with his hands until the interior was a seamless, pale chamber. He then installed the small, airtight iron door he had commissioned. Its fit was perfect, sealing with a heavy, satisfying clink. Above the firebox, he constructed a second, larger chamber, what the old stonemason had called a bell. This was the space where the hot gases from the fire would collect and swirl, allowing for a secondary burn. "The smoke itself will burn here," Hiram told Samuel, pointing into the dark opening. It was a concept so foreign to their experience that the boy could only nod in wonder. From this secondary combustion chamber, the true genius of Alistair's sketch began to take shape. Instead of a straight pipe to the roof, Hiram began building a long, winding maze for the smoke. He used flat fieldstones, carefully selected for their size and shape, and a mortar made from local clay, sand, and horsehair for tensile strength. The flue channel snaked back and forth, rising slowly through the growing mass of stone. It was a serpentine path, forcing the hot gases to travel nearly 30 feet horizontally and vertically before they would be allowed to escape. Each stone was laid with precision. Every joint was sealed with a double layer of the clay mortar. Hiram worked with a fanatic's focus, checking each course with his level, running his hands over every surface to feel for imperfections. The structure grew, a monolithic block of stone and clay rising in the middle of their home. It consumed the space, becoming the dominant feature of the room, an altar to some forgotten god of warmth. It did not take long for the neighbors to notice the strange project. Corwin was the first to come calling, his face a mask of feigned concern and barely concealed amusement. He peered into the cabin, at the half-finished stone monster that was taking shape. "Hiram," he said, unable to keep the ridicule from his voice. "What in God's name is that? It looks like you're building a tomb for yourself," he chuckled. "You'll be the first man to be buried and cremated at the same time." The name stuck. Others came to look, drawn by Corwin's reports. They called it Hiram's Folly. They would stand in the doorway, whispering and laughing. "He's lost his mind," one would say. "Grief over Finn and Ada has turned him." Another commented, "He'll use an entire winter's worth of wood just to get that rock pile warm. And by then, spring will be here." The most common fear, voiced with dramatic concern, was that the convoluted flue would fail to draw. "The smoke will have nowhere to go," Corwin declared to anyone who would listen. "It'll back up and fill the cabin. They'll choke in their sleep, him and his family." Hiram heard the whispers. He saw the mocking smiles and the pitying glances, but he paid them no mind. He was deaf to their skepticism. His world narrowed to the feel of stone, the texture of mortar, and the blueprint that existed only in his head. He worked from sunup to sundown, Samuel his silent and loyal apprentice. The boy asked few questions, trusting his father's vision with a faith the rest of the community lacked. Sarah, too, supported him without question, bringing them food and water, her presence a quiet affirmation in the face of the community's scorn. Her faith in him was another kind of fuel, one that burned slow and steady. The genius of the design was hidden within the stone, invisible to the casual observer. The critics saw only a clumsy pile of rocks. They didn't see the precisely angled throat connecting the firebox to the secondary chamber, designed to create a turbulent flow that would mix the hot gases with fresh air for a complete burn. They didn't see that the flue channels gradually decreased in size as they rose, a detail Hiram had devised to keep the gas velocity constant as it cooled. They didn't understand that the thick, clay-sealed stone walls were not just a structure, but a battery. A thermal battery designed to be charged with a short, intense burst of energy and then discharged slowly over many hours. They saw a tomb. Hiram saw a living, breathing system. He was not just building a stove, he was building a new relationship with fire itself. He was taming it, not by caging it in iron, but by persuading it to surrender its energy into the slow, steady heart of the stone. The final stone was laid in late autumn. The stove was a massive, rectangular column of rock and clay that rose from the floor and passed through the ceiling, where a short, well-insulated stovepipe vented through the roof. It was over 6 feet tall and 4 feet square, a hulking, primeval presence in the cabin. Hiram spent a week letting the clay mortar cure, lighting only tiny, smoldering fires of twigs to slowly drive the moisture out of the structure. The community watched, waiting for the final, definitive failure. The season was turning. The air grew crisp, and the morning frost lingered in the shadows. The time for theory was over. The folly was complete, and winter was coming to test it. Hiram chose a day when the first real cold snap of the season had settled over the valley. A bitter wind stripped the last of the leaves from the aspens, and the sky was a hard, metallic gray. The other cabins in the settlement had columns of thick, dark smoke rising from their chimneys, a sign that the iron stoves were already being fed a steady diet of cordwood. From Hiram's chimney, there was nothing. This, to the watchers, was the first sign of failure. Inside, the cabin was cold. Sarah and Samuel were bundled in wool sweaters, their breath misting in the air. Hiram approached the small iron door of his creation with a solemnity that felt like a prayer. He had stacked the small firebox with dry, split kindling, not large logs, but small pieces of pine and aspen that would burn hot and fast. He opened the damper at the top of the chimney pipe, struck a match, and lit the kindling. The flame caught immediately, and a rush of air was drawn into the firebox with a soft whoosh. He closed the airtight door. Through the small mica window he had insisted the blacksmith include, he watched the fire. It was not the lazy, smoldering fire of a potbelly stove. It was a contained inferno, a vortex of roaring flame. The small insulated space and the controlled air intake created a forge-like environment. The wood was consumed with incredible speed and ferocity. Within 20 minutes, the initial charge of wood was reduced to a bed of glowing coals. He added a few more small logs, and they too were consumed in a brilliant, clean burn. There was almost no smoke, only shimmering, transparent waves of heat. After just under an hour, the fire was spent. All that remained was a small pile of white ash. Hiram closed the chimney damper completely, sealing the heat inside the stone mass. And then they waited. For the first hour, nothing seemed to happen. The cabin remained cold. Samuel looked at his father, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Corwin, who had been watching from his own property, let out a triumphant laugh to his wife. "See? It's a dud," He's built himself a refrigerator. But Hiram was patient. He placed his hand on the stone surface. It was still cool to the touch. He waited. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a change began. A deep, resonant warmth began to bleed from the stone. It was not the sharp, aggressive heat of an iron stove. It was a gentle, pervasive radiance that seemed to warm the objects in the room, not just the air. The chill began to retreat from the corners. The floorboards lost their icy bite. Another hour passed, and the entire cabin was filled with a comfortable, even warmth. Hiram walked from one end of the room to the other. There were no cold spots, no drafts. Sarah took off her heavy shawl. Samuel shed his sweater. The stone monolith was now warm to the touch, like a sun-baked rock on a summer day. It was breathing heat into their home. The system worked. Outside, the neighbors saw no smoke. They saw Hiram and his family moving about inside without heavy coats. They couldn't understand it. It defied their entire experience. Corwin attributed it to stubborn pride. "He's just freezing in there, pretending it works," he scoffed to a friend. "He wasted his whole summer on that pile of rocks. He's not about to admit it was for nothing." They saw the successful outcome, but couldn't comprehend the process, so they dismissed it as a trick or as foolishness. They remained secure in their conventional wisdom, even as the evidence of its failure stood warm and silent in their midst. That night, as Hiram's family slept soundly in a peacefully warm cabin, the other settlers rose every few hours to feed their hungry stoves, stoking the fires that kept the deep cold at bay, never knowing that the war against winter had already been won next door. Winter arrived in earnest a few weeks later. It came not as a gentle snowfall, but as an invading army. The old-timers called it the White Ruin, a storm that would become the benchmark for all winters to come. It began with a heavy, wet snow that fell for 2 days straight, piling 3 feet of dense powder on the ground. Then the temperature plummeted, and the wind rose to a steady, shrieking gale. For 8 days, the sun vanished. The world became a formless, churning vortex of wind and snow. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a desperate battle for survival. Their potbelly stoves became ravenous gods demanding constant sacrifice. The fierce wind found every crack in the cabin walls, every gap around the window frames, pulling the precious heat out as fast as the stoves could produce it. To keep the cabins even remotely habitable, the fires had to be kept roaring at maximum intensity. Wood piles that were meant to last for weeks were being consumed in days. The men fought their way outside in the blinding whiteout to retrieve more wood, returning caked in snow, their beards frozen solid, only to find the cabin already chilling. Sleep was a luxury no one could afford. Families huddled together in a small radius around their red-hot stoves, dozing in shifts, one person always awake to feed the fire. Fear was a constant companion. The fear of a chimney fire from the intense heat, the fear of running out of wood. Corwin's family was suffering greatly. His cabin was on a slightly more exposed patch of land, and the wind assaulted it relentlessly. The snow drifted up against the north wall, reaching the roof line. He had already burned through his entire porch-side wood pile. He was now making perilous trips to his main stack, 100 feet from the cabin, and each journey left him more exhausted, more frozen. Inside, his wife and 2 small children were wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. They were burning wood at a terrifying rate, yet the far side of the room was so cold that a mug of water left there had frozen solid. On the 4th day of the storm, a section of their roof, heavy with snow, began to creak and sag ominously. The battle was being lost. In Hiram's cabin, the rhythm of life was entirely different. It was an oasis of calm in the midst of the hurricane. In the morning, Hiram would open the small iron door, shovel out the handful of white ash from the previous day's burn, and load the firebox with a small amount of dry wood. For about an hour, the fire would roar in its contained chamber, a brief and violent storm of energy. Then it would die out. He would close the damper, and that was it. For the next 12 hours, the massive stone stove radiated a constant, steady, silent warmth. The temperature inside the cabin never wavered. There were no cold spots, there were no drafts. The air was fresh and clean. They ate their meals at a table, read books, and slept through the night in peaceful comfort. Their indoor woodpile was barely diminished. The storm raged outside, an abstract concept, its fury unable to penetrate their sanctuary of thermal mass. On the morning of the 5th day, there was a brief lull in the wind. The snow still fell, but the shrieking gale had subsided to a low moan. It was during this lull that a frantic pounding came at Hiram's door. He opened it to find Corwin's wife, Mary. She was a ghost, her face gaunt and streaked with frozen tears, her shawl crusted with ice. "Hiram, please," she gasped, her words choked with desperation. "Corwin, he's sick. The fever. We ran out of wood inside last night. The fire is out. We're freezing." Without a word, Hiram pulled on his heavy coat and boots. He followed Mary back to her cabin. The sight inside was horrifying. The air was frigid, the silence profound. Corwin was lying in bed, shivering violently under a mound of blankets, his breathing shallow and ragged. The children were huddled together, their lips blue. The potbelly stove stood in the center of the room, a black, dead thing. Hiram knew Corwin couldn't be moved easily in his condition. He turned to Mary. "Bring the children to my cabin. Now, Sarah will care for them." He then went back outside, fought his way to his own woodpile, and returned with an armload of dry logs for Corwin's stove. It was a temporary measure, a single battle in a war Corwin had already lost. Hiram and another neighbor managed to move Corwin to Hiram's cabin later that day. When Corwin was carried through the door, the contrast struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had just come from a world of frantic effort and biting cold, a world defined by the roaring, hungry mouth of his iron stove. He entered a world of deep, silent, peaceful warmth. He looked toward the source, the great stone monolith he had derided as Hiram's folly. There was no fire, there was no glow. He reached out a trembling hand and touched its surface. It was warm, like a living creature. He looked at Hiram, and in that moment, in that silent, warm room, the full weight of his ignorance and the scale of Hiram's genius crashed down upon him. It was not a folly, it was a miracle. Hiram and another neighbor managed to move Corwin to Hiram's cabin later that day. When Corwin was carried through the door, the contrast struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had just come from a world of frantic effort and biting cold, a world defined by the roaring, hungry mouth of his iron stove. He entered a world of deep, silent, peaceful warmth. He looked toward the source, the great stone monolith he had derided as Hiram's folly. There was no fire, there was no glow. He reached out a trembling hand and touched its surface. It was warm, like a living creature. He looked at Hiram, and in that moment, in that silent, warm room, the full weight of his ignorance and the scale of Hiram's genius crashed down upon him. It was not a folly, it was a miracle. The system he had mocked had been tested by the worst storm in living memory, and it had not bent, let alone broken. It was absolute vindication, delivered not with a triumphant shout, but with the quiet, undeniable evidence of radiant heat. Hiram and another neighbor managed to move Corwin to Hiram's cabin later that day. When Corwin was carried through the door, the contrast struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had just come from a world of frantic effort and biting cold, a world defined by the roaring, hungry mouth of his iron stove. He entered a world of deep, silent, peaceful warmth. He looked toward the source, the great stone monolith he had derided as Hiram's folly. There was no fire, there was no glow. He reached out a trembling hand and touched its surface. It was warm, like a living creature. He looked at Hiram, and in that moment, in that silent, warm room, the full weight of his ignorance and the scale of Hiram's genius crashed down upon him. It was not a folly, it was a miracle. The system he had mocked had been tested by the worst storm in living memory, and it had not bent, let alone broken. It was absolute vindication, delivered not with a triumphant shout, but with the quiet, undeniable evidence of radiant heat. When the white ruin finally broke and the sun returned to a world buried and transformed, the settlement slowly came back to life. The stories of the storm were shared in hushed tones, tales of collapsed roofs, of frostbite, of families who had burned their furniture to survive. Amid the stories of hardship, a new legend was born, the story of Hiram's cabin, the warm place, the house that had tamed the winter. The first visitor was Corwin. He was still weak, but he walked to Hiram's cabin with a straight back. There was no mockery left in his eyes, only a deep and profound humility. He stood before Hiram, a man he had ridiculed for months, and found he had no words. He simply said, "Teach me." It was not a request, it was a plea. He didn't just want to know how to build the stove, he wanted to understand the thinking behind it. He wanted to shed the conventional wisdom that had almost cost him his family. Hiram felt no triumph, no desire for apology. He saw in Corwin's face not a rival who had been defeated, but a neighbor who had suffered. He invited him in, sat him down at the table, and with a piece of charcoal on a spare shingle, he began to draw. He explained the principles of thermal mass, of secondary combustion, of making the smoke walk its long road. He held nothing back. He shared his knowledge freely, his only motivation the memory of Finn and Ada, and the sight of Corwin's children with blue-tinged lips. Soon, others came. One by one, the men of the settlement, who had stood in groups laughing at his folly, now came to his door alone, their hats in their hands. They asked their questions quietly, respectfully. Hiram answered them all. He spent the rest of that spring and summer as the settlement's unofficial engineer. He didn't build the stoves for them, but he taught them the principles, supervising their work, helping them find the right stones, showing them how to mix the clay mortar. That summer, the settlement was filled with the sounds of construction. In cabin after cabin, the inefficient iron stoves were dismantled and replaced by massive stone and clay structures. They were not all identical to Hiram's original. Some were smaller, some were L-shaped to fit into corners, some were faced with smooth river stones. The settlers adapted the design to their own needs and materials, but the core principles remained the same. A small, hot firebox, a secondary combustion chamber, and a long, winding flue to capture the heat within a great thermal mass. The idea was no longer Hiram's. It had become the community's. The following winter, a traveling land surveyor was caught by an early blizzard and forced to take refuge in the settlement. He stayed for 2 months, moving from one family to another, and he was astonished. He had spent years on the frontier, and he had never experienced a winter of such comfort and security. He was fascinated by the stoves. He saw how little wood they consumed, how safe and steady their heat was. Being a man of meticulous habits, he spent weeks documenting the design. He drew detailed schematics, interviewed Hiram and the other builders, and filled his journal with notes on combustion theory and heat transfer. When the surveyor left in the spring, he carried the idea with him. His journals were copied and passed among other surveyors, builders, and land agents. The design, stripped of its personal history, began to spread across the territories. It was never called the Hiram stove. In one region, it became known as the double burn box. In another, where the surveyor's notes were particularly influential, it was called the Garrett heater, after the surveyor himself. In other places, it was simply called the prairie kiln or the settler's hearth. The innovation became a piece of anonymous folk technology, its origins in the grief and obsession of a single man completely forgotten. The idea had been set free, and its creator was left behind. Decades passed. The settlement grew into a proper town. The frontier pushed further west. Hiram lived a long and quiet life. He watched his son Samuel grow up and build his own home, complete with a masonry stove of his own design. He saw his grandchildren play on the warm floor of his cabin, safe from the winter cold. He was a respected elder in the community, but his legendary innovation was now just part of the landscape. The younger generation grew up with the great stone stoves as a simple fact of life, as common and unquestioned as the log walls of their homes. They had no idea that there was ever a time before them, a time of cold corners and hungry iron beasts. Hiram died peacefully in his sleep one autumn night, in the warm and quiet cabin he had built with his own hands. His funeral was well attended by the children and grandchildren of the people he had saved and taught. They remembered him as a good neighbor, a skilled trapper, and a kind man. His simple wooden gravestone, carved by his son, read, "Hiram, husband, father, neighbor." There was no mention of the inventor, the engineer, the man who had single-handedly changed their relationship with winter. His legacy was not written in stone, but in the ambient warmth of every home in the valley. The impact of his creation was immeasurable. It was counted in the lives not lost to cold, in the children who grew up without the constant threat of a winter death, in the forests that were spared because of the stove's incredible efficiency. Years later, travelers and historians passing through the region would note the unique design of the local hearths, remarking on their ingenuity and effectiveness. They would attribute it to the collective, anonymous wisdom of the settlers, a product of hardy frontier adaptation. The truth of the lone, grieving innovator who stared at a cold iron stove and decided to defy fate was lost to time, buried under the quiet success of his creation. Sometimes, on the coldest winter nights, a traveler crossing the high plains might look down into a sleeping valley. He would see the scattered lights of homes, each one a pinprick of warmth and safety against the vast, indifferent cold. From the chimneys, there would be no plume of black smoke, no sign of a desperate, roaring fire. There would only be the faint, shimmering whisper of heat rising into the crystalline air, the slow, steady exhalation of 100 stone hearts, all breathing out the enduring warmth of a forgotten man's brilliant, beautiful folly.